So what I'm going to do here is highlight a few things that I hope will guide the work that you're going to embark on, which is on sector-based country-level analysis, to put some flesh on the work that has been done on capital flight, which is what I work on, and illicit financial flows, but which has been mostly on at the aggregate level, at the national level. Now it's time to go deeper into the analysis, look at where these flows are originating from, and can get that sense, or give us a sense of what are the potential implications for development, but also the potential strategies that we can use to stem these flows. So I'll talk about why we care about, remind you about what we care about illicit financial flows. This has come up in the first session, and what makes a capital flow illicit. And I'll say why I wanted to say that. I'll give you a rundown about the typology of international financial flows. Talk briefly about the measurement of illicit financial flows and capital flight, the drivers, and what I think to be, at least from my perspective, what would be the value added of the work that you are going to undertake. Then I'll make some notes on data that you should be aware of. So first of all, there was a comment by one of the presentation that sometimes there is a duplication of effort where think tanks and civil society institutions want to advance a particular cause, and they bring people to do research, which actually is a research in research that has already been done. So one of the first thing I want to do is to give you some pointers about work that already exists. The first book, which was on Africa's odious debt, with Jim Boyce, my colleague. There is a recent book which provides a rundown of the key themes around capital flight, including governance, the international financial system, corruption, capital flight, asset repatriation, and so on. This is an OUP book that has just been released. I also want to point you to a paper that that's going to appear in the African Studies Review, where I talk about globalization in the context of Africa in the context of globalization. There were some issues, some coming from Vera about globalization that is not new, that Africa has always been integrated in the global economy. Also the issues that Patrick documents about the gains and losses of Africa from trade and FDI and so on. All those are discussed here. What basically I argue about here is that globalization is not new, but it's actually the face of globalization in terms of its impact on African countries is changing its face. It's changing, but also the costs are increasing. That the integration is becoming more challenging, the rules of the game have changed to the disadvantage of African economies. So take a look at it's already posted as a working paper if you want to check it out. This to say actually that for researchers who want to engage in this work on these financial flows, it's not, there is already work that has already been done, and you can learn a lot from what's going on already. Even on in terms of country studies, the African Economic Research Consortium is sponsoring currently case studies on capital flight and its implications in on 12 countries, including Zimbabwe. But again, the focus of each study is different. Some studies are looking at the capital flight and natural resources, capital flight and institutions, which are also say more about down later in the presentation. So why do we care about illicit financial flows? first of all, illicit financial flows is not only an African problem. I think this came up. But it is very important to underscore the fact that capital flight and illicit financial flows are a bigger problem for African countries than to other countries. There is very interesting work that's coming up, for example, on what is referred to as the missing private wealth, where even for developed countries, you find a huge discrepancies between what is the declared values of, say, earnings by private investors and the payments of investment incomes. And you find that it's as if some income and earnings that have been paid by somebody were never earned by anybody, because the earner never declared the income. And it's also as if the world is a net payer to itself. I mean, how do you become a net payer to itself, to yourself? So that's true for developed countries, but also true for developing countries. But I argue that the problem is a bigger challenge for developing countries, which are suffering from huge financing deficits, and also the beneficiaries of these undeclared, unrecorded flows tends to be developed countries. So the developing world is actually financing the developed world. A very bizarre Lucas paradox, as referred to in the literature. But so illicit financial flows, the reason we care about it, first of all, they constitute a development issue. They undermine domestic resource mobilization. Patrick did mention, going back to Keynes, that development ought to be domestically financed. The challenge with African countries is that we still depend on foreign financing, and we talk about economic transformation, sustainable development, inclusive development. You will not reach that as long as you are financed by somebody else. You will not own your policies as long as somebody else finances your budget. So even as African countries are making efforts to increase domestic resource mobilization, more and more resources are leaking out of the continent. So you don't actually get to benefit from your effort, because mobilizing taxes is painful. Nobody wants to pay taxes, but at least you feel more comfortable if you pay taxes and you see the benefits. In the case of African countries, there is the benefits are lagging behind the cost. Public service delivery is also undermined by illicit financial flows. In our first book, we did illustrate the impact of capital flight by documenting the losses in terms of social development, human development. We quantified the number of children that are dying because of lack of access to social services, because the countries are busy paying the debt that financed capital flight in the past. Also, in the recent book that I showed you, there is one of the best work that has been ever done in the area, which documents the gains that African countries who have generated if they had been able to keep the capital on shore and invest more, increase investment, increase growth, and that would have allowed them to make more progress in terms of poverty reduction. 2015 has come and is almost gone, and most of African countries have not reached the MDGs. We, in this paper, which is by Jamte, my friend Kurunziza, he actually shows that if African countries had been able to keep the capital on the continent, they would have made much more progress in reaching the MDGs. Even from a development financing perspective, illicit financial flows that are concerned because they undermine aid effectiveness. Because some of the capital flight or illicit financial flows is financed by the funds that were borrowed by the countries to finance development. So if you're going to assess whether aid has been effective, you have first of all to discount the amount of aid that went out back as private wealth. And then this is a point that I think would be even more interesting for think tanks and civil society organizations, which economists don't tend to emphasize, is the equity dimension of illicit financial flows. Because you know for sure that the African actors who benefit from capital flight and illicit financial flows are part of the elite, the political elite and the economic elite. Now, these are also the ones who are in charge of development policies, social policies. The people who lose out of this process are the poor and the middle class, whatever you call it, the middle class, the working people who have to face the shortage of access to social services, education, and health because the government doesn't have the resources to finance those services. So this deepens inequality because not only the capitalists are benefiting from this expropriation of resources, but also the working class, the farmers, the rural area dwellers, don't have access to social services. So not only income inequality increases, but also what I call social development inequality increases as well because of illicit financial flows. Now, we talk about illicit financial flows, which implicitly we have to understand what we mean by illicit. In the literature of illicit financial flows, what we call illicit is a flow which is illicit at 3 levels. At one of the 3 levels. Sometimes it's more than one. One is on the acquisition. A flow which originates from wealth which was illicitly acquired is an illicit flow. So if somebody steals money and then transfers it abroad, that becomes illicit. It is illicit also if it is transferred illegally, which means it's not declared with the national authorities, the central bank, customs, and so on. That makes illicit by transfer. But also, wealth becomes illicit if it is hidden and not declared, reported to the government, mostly generally for the sake of evading the inquisition about where the origin of the wealth, but also to evade taxation. Once the money reaches abroad, the private wealth holder may wish not to report the capital because they don't want to pay taxes on income. So, but what is difficult, and I find sometimes heroic efforts by my colleagues at GFI to quantify what proportion of illicit financial flows is due to corruption versus other things. I find it heroic. How do you define corruption, first of all? If you look at all these 3 levels, for that to happen, there has to be a degree of corruption. If capital is earned illegally, somebody must have corrupted somebody. For capital to be transferred without being recorded, somebody must corrupt somebody. At the customs, at the airport, at the banks, where it is being deposited, that has to happen. But also, for wealth to be held abroad without being declared, somebody has to corrupt somebody. It means that the financial institution that's holding the capital, the wealth, knows that they should be reporting that, but they are not reporting it. Secrecy jurisdictions, that's where that's their specialization. So I encourage you to go find the percentage of illicit financial flow attributed to corruption. You are heroes. Statistically, it's not possible. I just find it difficult. So now when we think about asset held abroad, it is again important to know that not all capital held by Africans abroad is illegal. There is substantial amount of capital held by Africans in cash or physical form, which is actually legal, where Africans declare their investments abroad, declare their bank transfers abroad, declare their bank accounts abroad, and they are making money, they're getting rich, and they are paying their taxes. That's possible. It's part of it's a part of the wealth held by Africans. But there are other forms of parts of African private wealth, which can be challenged vis-a-vis its legality. This is the case where, again, money may have been acquired illegally, transferred illegally, so that has to be challenged. So when we talk about repatriation of stolen assets, we are aiming to the assets which are illegal by acquisition, by transfer, by concealment abroad, which means not paying taxes. Now, illicit financial flows are, again, only one subset of the broad flows that between African countries and the rest of the world. There are legal capital outflows, which are recorded in the country's books, which we call the balance of payments. These include illicitly acquired funds, normal FDI, which is declared, but also illicitly acquired funds. Now, unfortunately, some of the funds which are illicitly acquired are recorded in the balance of payment. An example is money laundering. Money could be earned from drug dealing or money laundered into the banking system domestically. Once it reaches the banking system, domestic banking system, the owner may transfer it abroad legally. So when you see funds recorded in the balance of payments, don't infer that they are illicit. Do not infer that they are legal. So they could be legally reported, duly reported funds, which nonetheless are illicit. What does it mean? It means that our measures of capital flight is not a comprehensive measure of illicit financial flows. Because for us, per the economic definition of capital flight, as long as it is reported, it's not capital flight. Yet, I'm telling you that some funds could be illicit, based on the three levels of illicit: acquisition, transfer, and holding. So capital flight, the way we define it, is unrecorded capital outflows, which can again include illicitly acquired funds, which leave the country or evade the recording because they want to evade taxation, or wants to evade to avoid being stolen by a corrupt government, for example. But also they can include illicitly acquired funds. So, for example, stolen assets by politicians. They are not going to declare it when they leave the country. This is the case of suitcases full of cash that leave the country because of diplomatic immunity. They are not recorded, and that has happened over and over again. There was a case in Burundi where the person who was in charge of corruption, or what do we call it, accountability officer in the government, was caught depositing $400,000 in a bank in Belgium. Now, what's funny is, why did the bank choose to report him to the police when they actually don't report people who deposit hundreds of millions? Maybe if he had deposited 300 millions, they would not have reported this. I bet they would not have done. But they want to show that they are actually doing their job, and here we have caught a small fish, we let the big fish go. Other illicit financial flows. Now, there are flows which are not captured by a measure of capital flight. These include payments of smuggled imports, payments associated with contraband trade, and so on. Those are very difficult to measure. Profit shifting by multinational corporations through transfer pricing, financial arrangements, and so on. Now, these are very, very problematic. How do you measure them and capture them into the illicit financial flow measure? We can't capture them into capital flight. Because, first of all, when if you take the case of transfer pricing, it's a process of shifting profit from a high tax jurisdiction to a low tax jurisdiction. These are the transactions are going to be duly recorded in the balance of payments, so we are not going to capture them as unrecorded. And yet they are illicit because the company is cheating the country in not paying its taxes, inflating its charges to deflate its profits in the country. That's why when you're doing country studies, we would want to see that. Some estimates of tax losses due to transfer pricing, even if we are not going to add it to our measure of illicit financial flows or capital flight, I still want to know that. What is the country losing through abuse of tax regimes by corporations? I also would like to know how much the country is losing through the government's own mistakes. It's through, for example, generous tax waivers that are given to corporations operating in very profitable sectors. They get 25 tax holidays to dig oil. Why do you need 25 tax holidays to dig oil? Because what many times happen, I see some of the studies are going to be on mining, others are on tourism, and this happens over and over again. If you look at the profit rates by industries, there is no way you can justify why corporations should be given 25 tax holidays. And what many times happens is that after the tax holiday duration has expired, what happens? The companies change name. So they sell the company to another company, which then gets another 25 years holiday. So I think even as we want to look at what other actors are doing to cheat African governments, countries, we also want to see what our governments are doing to cheat African people in collusion with multinational corporations. Because again, here's my point about corruption. When those things happen, I bet you a government official is benefiting from it. Every time a big corporation gets a tax waiver, I bet you somebody in the government is benefiting from it. So there's a lot of political economy issues that need to be dealt with here. And also there are other forms of flows which are not financial, which are in kind, that actually would be useful to explore, especially to study on wildlife and even minerals. Sometimes it's not money that's crossing the borders, it's actually quantities of gold and minerals and coltan and so on that's leaving the country without being declared in the government exports. Those are also illicit. I think it would be good to quantify those too. Even though you will not get an exhaustive measure, it would be at least interesting to get a sense of what are the orders of magnitude, who are the players, where is the destination. One day we were in Senegal launching the first book, and we had a discussion with somebody who I will not name, who gave us accounts of cargo planes landing in one of the Western African country at the airport at night, full of drugs and minerals and so on, and continuing it through the desert to be sold in Europe. So aeroplane lands, unloaded on the back of donkeys and camels through the desert, and money goes. But those you won't be able to see them if you look at the balance of payments. But I think it would be good to actually document those things too. So when we think about illicit financial flows, it's a subset of the broader flows between a country and the rest of the world. So this is what the point I make here, that illicit financial flows may constitute a broader domain than capital flight. That's why when people compare, for example, our measures of capital flight to GFI's illicit financial flows, ours are smaller because I'll show you the difference that makes it bigger. Also, very, very important. If you're doing research on illicit financial flows, you have to be clear that you are telling the reader what it is that you are measuring. For a flow to be called, for an operation to generate an illicit financial flow, it has to be, there has to be a cross-border flow. Let me give you an example. So if I'm an investor in a Zimbabwean investor, and investing in Zimbabwe, and I'm using domestically sourced inputs, and I'm cheating the government on my taxes, it has nothing to do with illicit financial flows. There was no capital that left Zimbabwe and went out of the continent. So you have to be very, very, very clear that you are actually documenting a flow associated with cross-border transaction. Okay? Note that tax evasion, which is domestically originated, is not important, but that's not part of our work on illicit financial flows. When that happens, the reason why I also want to pay attention to that, it may be a symptom that something bigger is happening that may actually also be related to illicit financial flows. Okay. So the other point I want to make is illicit financial flows are a global problem. For illicit financial flows to happen, something has to take place at the origin, and there has to be facilitation at the destination too. If only, this is a point I make all the time, if only Africans were corrupt, there will be no illicit financial flows between Africa and the rest of the world. The reason why they continue is because there's corruption at the end that facilitates, abets, helps in the concealment of illicit financial flows. So when you think about solutions, that has to come in your mind. You can do our best to clean up our house, we have to do that. But if the other house is not clean, it's going to be very difficult. When I say the other house, I mean the global financial system. Let me make my point even more clear. When you are looking at illicit financial flows for Zimbabwe and so on, of course it will be very interesting to know who are the culprits. What are the nodes of this long chain of operation that leads to capital flight? And can I then say Africans are responsible for 20%? We like numbers. Global actors are responsible for 80% and so on. Corruption is 20%, non-corruption is, again, be careful. Because, as I told you, GFI, for example, tells you that it's in the high-level panel report, because they use the GFI, that corruption accounts for 3% of IFFs. I don't believe it. There's no way you can explain that. No way. When you go back to the definition of illicit financial flows, at which point is there no corruption? There's corruption at every level of the transaction. But there are some mechanisms and conduits which are easier to document. For example, trade misinvoicing. That one you can calculate, you can estimate transfer pricing, tax evasion, and all that. But you should be sure that you're actually able to measure what you claim you are measuring. Or the leakages of the balance of payments, that's easy. You reconcile inflows and outflows of resources, and you can say this is the amount of leakage. How do we measure illicit financial flows? First of all, as far as quantification, if you go to Genesis, capital flight predates IFF. So the work of GFI was based on the work of capital flight. And in fact, the first publication they had, although it was called illicit financial flows, it was capital flight. But they liked the concept of illicit financial flows for the issues that we discussed here. But in the literature, in economics literature, we do not have a measure of illicit financial flows, because in the economic literature, we do not have a definition of illicit financial flows. Whereas in economics, we have a very old definition of capital flight, which we use. Now, you can go from the measure of capital flight and add the different conduits and mechanisms of financial flows which are illicit, and then you can generate increasingly a measure of illicit financial flows. It will be not comprehensive, because we really can't, unless people become honest and tell us where they hide their money, it's impossible to do that. So what I'm going to show you is briefly how we measure capital flight, and I'll tell you how the measure generated by GFI relates to the measure of capital flight. It's just one twist. Capital flight is measured as a residual from the balance of payments. If you take inflows of resources and compared to the use of resources, they should net out to zero. If they don't, then you have unexplained outflows. That's what we call capital flight. So it's a leakage in the balance of payments, adjusted for unrecorded debt in the capital account. That's why instead of using the capital account, we use the change in debt, and added the adjustment for trade misinvoicing to basically correct errors in the current account. But again, the measure of capital flight is reading the balance of payments and getting the residual. Then the estimate of illicit financial flows that GFI publishes is what they call gross unrecorded outflows. So the difference between capital flight as measured in the literature and GFI's measure of IFF is that when the adjustment on trade is negative, GFI sets it to zero. That's the only difference. Now, in economics, you can't explain why you would do that, but GFI has a reason why they do that. The reason is, they say, since they are looking at what Africa is losing in terms of flows, they don't care about the money that enters unrecorded, the imports that entered unrecorded, because government is not benefiting and so on. That's an argument, but I can't make that in an academic paper, so I can't use it. But that's the key difference. If you took a country and measured capital flight to get IFF, then net out the negative trade misinvoicing, and you get IFF. It's, again, you can see it's really a starting point. We need to go deeper and look at all the mechanisms through which money leaks out of the country through the various channels I showed you. And unfortunately, you can't do that with the aggregate data that we get. You do that with country data, with sectoral data, product data, and so on. So that's what I'm saying here. To get a better handle of, get closer to a good measure of illicit financial flows, you have to go to the sector level, product level, and I'll say things that I expect. I'm going to run quickly through this unless people want me to explain. So basically, the balance of payment, change in debt stands for the capital account because of the unrecorded thing of debt. Private capital flows, FDI and portfolio flows. In our previous measures, we do not include portfolio flows, but I'm in the process of updating our series, and I'm going to add portfolio flows. Initially, if you look at the countries, most African countries, portfolio flows were zero. So we say there's no point. But starting from the beginning of the 2000s, you do see that the volume of portfolio flows are increasing, even in countries that don't have stock markets. So we're going to add that in the calculation. And then the uses, covering the current capital account and the change in the reserves. And then we add trade misinvoicing to correct the capital account. The current account. Okay. So the capital flight is a smaller subset of illicit financial flows. It's really a smaller than the measured illicit financial flows, and even the measure that we have from GFI is really a subset of the total world of illicit financial flows. There is a difference between the academic orientation of this work and the advocacy orientation of this work. In academic orientation, in the academic literature, the focus is on capital flight. The advocacy world wants to look at the broader set of illicit financial flows. Even with capital flight, has always been having a challenge to get the concept adopted or appreciated in the mainstream economics, because you're basically doing what Patrick was doing, which is challenging the notion that the markets work fine, that you should not meddle with the capitalist system. It's going to allocate the capital effectively. We don't believe that. And that's why it's going to be difficult to publish a paper on capital flight in the AER. But that's not my job. It's not my goal. And you have an even harder time publishing a paper on illicit financial flows anyway, in academic journals. But that's not your objective. But strategically, what should we be doing? I think for advocacy institutions, you have to ask yourself critically, where is your value added? Is it doing academic research, or is it informing the public and asking the serious, uncomfortable questions that actually challenge the policymakers, challenge the researchers? Which means that if you want to do all that, you're going to be spread too thin. Leverage the work that's already being done in the academic profession and try to pick holes in the literature. What are the issues that are not being raised? What are the uncomfortable questions that are not being raised? And why do they matter for development? And why do they matter for policy? I think that would be a better use of your energy and your resources. But if you want to build another research institution that's going to do academic research on financial flows, academic research on capital flight, and so on, it's already being done. Why do you want to do that? The kind of work that you are promoting now is more interesting. Let's go in the agriculture sector and dig into who are the players, what kind of resources are coming into the sector, what are they producing, and who is benefiting, what kind of regulatory environment is facilitating these inflows, what kind of regulatory environment is facilitating this rent sharing between the public, the private, between the domestic and the foreign. I think that would be more interesting. I have 30 minutes? Okay, good. 10 minutes times 3, that's good. Also, as you think about what you should be doing, it's about, you don't have to compete with other institutions. It's about leveraging. If somebody has already done the work for you anyway, and you have so much work to do on your own, why do you want to redo the work that somebody else has done? And also, I think networking makes a lot of sense. I'm a networking person, have been punished for that, but I think that's the way you advance your work. You don't want to do everything on your own. You want to build networks, collaborative networks that actually advance your own cause. So that as a think tank, as an advocacy institution, you want to focus your energy where your comparative advantage is, which is about mobilizing policy debate. You need to ask the questions, you need to push the envelope in terms of the analysis, but also query whether the policy debate is in the right place. Okay? Now, if you look at the evidence, again, this you know from the work we did, from the work on by the panel, it is financial flows that are a chronic problem. It's not new. It's not in the past 10 years, but it has been there forever. The problem is getting worse. The volumes are actually increasing. Trade misinvoicing is a big issue, and that's a big concern, especially for the sectors that you'll be looking at, because if you look at most of our countries, not just in the region, but also continent-wide, the biggest exports are from the 3 sectors that you have identified: agriculture, mining, and tourism. So if we are not getting the right value for our trade, we need to know who is benefiting, what are the facilitating factors. Profit shifting and tax evasion is also a big problem. But again, as I said, I need to know why that happens, who are the facilitators, domestic and foreign. How is there anything wrong with our tax system that may be facilitating this? Then in the literature, you learn a lot about the drivers of illicit financial flows. What would be interesting in your studies is to see which factors are more pertinent for your particular sector, because these are findings that are drawn from aggregate analysis. We talk about habit formation in the sense that you find that countries that have capital flight tend to have even more capital flight because of the underlying environment that facilitates capital flight, but also what capital flight does to the governance mechanism. Structural features, again, natural resources, the macroeconomic environment, economic governance, corruption. Here, I want to underscore the point that when we talk about corruption, especially when we are doing this kind of analysis, we need to know that corruption is not a public thing. It's not a public sector thing. Corruption is also a private sector thing. Because many times, corruption takes place at the initiative of the private operator. We tend to think that the government officials are the ones that are corrupt mostly. It's actually not true all the time. It's the multinational corporations make that as their business strategy. Then embezzlement of the debt, we have written a lot about the revolving door and political factors. Then I want you to pay attention to global factors. Again, as I said, one of the reasons why capital flight illicit financial flow also keeps increasing is because they find a conducive environment abroad where money is held in secrecy. Poor enforcement of rules. So if you're looking at your particular sector, what I would hope to see is a good analysis of the regulation of that particular sector. What are the rules that govern mining in your country? And who sets the rules? And who benefits from the rules? What are the flows that may be exploited by the operators? Inadequate exchange of information. I also would like to know, in your particular country, what kind of tax information exchange agreements it has with other countries. Because one of the things that has facilitated progress in the US, which is making a lot of progress in breaking the glass ceiling and the glass wall in terms of the banking secrecy, is by establishing very stringent tax information exchange with countries, including Switzerland and other countries. And we see already progress in terms of publication of banking records, because the Treasury realized that they are losing a lot of tax money. So the war against tax evasion that you see being waged in the US is not because they are concerned about the impact on development. No. It's because they are concerned about the impact on Treasury. Now, how can we as an African continent leverage on that momentum? Because the US has the possibility to crack down on tax evasion through banking secrecy, because they can tell a Swiss bank that unless you release your report, you're no longer listed at the New York Exchange. And that's a credible threat. We can't do that. But how can we leverage that? In the few weeks ago, there was the big international UN conference on financing development. We had a session actually on the issue of corporate taxation, where our frustration is that the debate is being driven by OECD countries. In fact, it was really amazing in the medical sense that the representative of the OECD tried to convince us that it's okay the way the system is set up, that OECD is in charge of driving the debate on tax evasion because it also works for developing countries. Okay. I say, but if you think we developing countries are also affected, why should we be at the table discussing these things? They say, oh no, then you have to broaden the debate. Then if you put it in the UN system, the UN is not efficient at doing that, because then you have to have a government body that's going to do it. And I'm thinking, if government bodies can work in the OECD, why can't they work in the UN? Would it be that the OECD governments are actually undermining the UN? Very, very interesting questions. So if tax evasion is going to be combated, you need both developed governments and developing governments to be in the room, because they have different issues that they need to put on the table. This, I'm not going to dwell on this. Yes. So what do I see as value added from this kind of research? First is a good institutional and political economy analysis, which I have to admit, except for Patrick and people like him, as economists we feel uncomfortable doing political economy. Because doing political economy means naming names. And we want to be on the safe side vis-a-vis the power holders. So once you're touching power, then you're going to be marginalized and all that, and actually you have to be very courageous to do that. But I think unless you want to go deeper in issues in terms of regulation, rules, ownership, it's going to be not very useful to do a country study which basically repeats what we have already said at the aggregate level. Because what I'm looking for is things that I have not been able to do because I was looking at the forest. You are going into the trees and bushes and see what is happening. Issues of ownership. So for example, if you look at the mining sector, I want to know who are the operators, which are the companies, who owns those companies, how much does the government own, because I want to know implications on rent sharing, who benefits from the rent. It would be one thing that a corporation is not paying taxes and it's a national corporation. It's a different thing if it is not paying taxes and it's a foreign corporation. It's one thing if the money is leaking from the government coffers and is being invested in the country. It's a separate thing, it's invested in the Cayman Islands. So that's why issues of ownership are important, because you want to see implications for wealth transfer and who is the residual claimant for the rent being extracted. Because we know there is a lot of rent extraction in these institutions, in these sectors, but we want to know who is the rent beneficiary. The other thing is to really unpack the kind of things we have said about mechanisms of IFFs, but looking at the more aggregate level. Trade misvoicing, for example, we said is a big issue. I would think that value added for the study on mining, for example, would be to look at trade misvoicing just for the mining sector. And then look at the key trade partners and estimate the trade misvoicing vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis UK, vis-a-vis a particular country. Because we now say, this money actually goes somewhere. Where is that somewhere? And who is that? Also, you can get a better sense of the motives of illicit financial flows. Is it tax evasion? How much transfer pricing goes into the sector? So, for example, if you look at some of the studies done by ActionAid, Global Transparency International, and so on Zambia's mining sector, where the biggest trade partner, the biggest importer of Zambian copper is Switzerland, and Switzerland has no industry. So how come that happens, that money is exported in the books to Switzerland, actually being used in China? Something is fishy. So that would be easy to do on a country level, sectoral level. So that would be, so I want to know the actors, domestic, foreign, private, public, the role of safe havens or tax havens. Note on data quickly. One of the reasons why it's important to do country studies is that when you look at aggregate data, global databases are inadequate. African countries tend to be very underrepresented. The data is not there. So you will have to roll your sleeves and go to government statistical offices. You'll have to go talk to the companies. They will push you back. You'll have to talk to people. So I saw in some of the proposals that you're going to do some interviews. That's really, really good. The value added is you want to do it's investigative work, or almost detective work. Very good. The last point, you don't need it unless you're going to update your aggregate series, in which case, please let me know. I'll talk to you about a few things that you need to be aware of. For some reason, the IMF keep changing the way they present the data, and it's confusing. For example, if you took, say, change in reserves or FDI from the old database up to 2008 and added the new database the data from the new database, you get the wrong signs. For some reason, from 2000, in the new database, you find the signs are flipped. Definition-wise, you can understand it. But if you are going to do capital flight measurements, because it's a reading of the balance of payments, you want to go with the old historical presentation. So if anybody is interested in this, let me know. We can talk more about this. But I'm really excited about what I think could be important value added for these country studies at the sector level. Encourage you. It's not easy. If you find it easy, you're not doing your job. Thank you very much.